Well, welcome once again, everyone. For those of you who just joined us, my name's Keith Keeley. I'm the Executive Director of the Savannah Institute, and I am just thrilled that this year at the Perennial Farm Gathering, our keynote message is going to be delivered by Chef Sean Sherman. To introduce Chef Sherman, I'm delighted to welcome my friend, chef and author, Beth Dooley, who will be introducing him. If you don't know Beth, let me tell you a little bit about her and how she's connected with Sean. Beth is a James Beard award-winning food writer who has authored and co-authored over a dozen books celebrating the bounty of America's Northern Heartland. She writes for the Minneapolis Star Tribune, appears regularly on local TV and radio, and helps people connect with food more deeply through bare bones cooking with her middle son, Kip. In addition to writing about local food in the Northern Heartland, Beth guides local food trips for wilderness inquiry via Taste of the Apostles. Beth currently serves as an endowed chair for the Minnesota Institute of Sustainable Agriculture at the University of Minnesota. Her most recent book, which I've had the pleasure of having a preview of, and it's wonderful, highly recommend, and you can check it out, I believe, here at the conference, at the gathering, pardon me, is called Chili, Clove, and Cardamom, a gastronomic journey into fragrances and flavors of desert cuisines, which she co-wrote with Gary Nabhan, who you may recall we just recognized was one of the past recipients of the Deep Roots Award here at the Perennial Farm Gathering. So, Beth, thank you so much for being here to introduce your friend, Chef Sean Sherman.
Thanks so much, Keith and Heather and everybody that pulled this conference together. It's so wonderful to be here looking out at this gorgeous lake and to hear about all the incredible work you're doing and continue to do. It's such an honor to share the stage with Sean. He's not only a dear friend, but as you can tell up on the screen, a remarkable, multi-talented man. So I won't go into that because he's going to say more about himself, and I'm going to keep this short because you really want to hear from him. What I wanted to say is that Sean is first and foremost an educator. He is a remarkable mind that doesn't stop asking questions. And it's something that I think we can all be empowered to do because he inspires us to do so. And it's through Sean, through his food, that I think we can really understand our world, our history, our ecology, and everything we need to do to create more food sovereignty and to empower people to really reach out and be with each other in a way that promotes peace. The reason why Sean is such a good educator is because he is a humble student. He doesn't stop. And he has this incredible innate ability to marry traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, with his skill, his perseverance, his resilience, and his understanding of science. And it's the marrying of traditional ecological knowledge and science that is going to bring this world forward. And so with that, I just want to close by saying he doesn't accept the cultural narrative as it has existed for over 300 years. He doesn't stop asking questions, and he challenges us to look at new ways of seeing our world so that we can all become more sovereign, food sovereign, and we can help support communities who really want to do so. So with that, let's welcome Sean to the stage. You're going to love this presentation. He's amazing.
All right. Petuashte, Hamatakiape, Wambli Watakpe, Nichiape. My name is Sean Sherman. I'm from Pine Ridge, South Dakota, and I just greeted you in Lakota. My Lakota name is Charging Eagle, which I thought sounded really cool when I got it, until I grew up and discovered it just meant I spent all my money on credit cards. So I'm currently living in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I do have a restaurant there. It was many years in the making. I formed my company called The Sous Chef in 2014, and I've been doing this talk quite a bit over the past decade, and it's always morphing a little by little. Some people may have seen it, some people may haven't, but really I just want to talk about why we do what we do, why understanding Indigenous food systems is an important thing for all of us to understand, whether we're Indigenous or not, and really trying to understand the connection that we have to the earth around us, to all of the things around us, basically. And so what we try to do at our restaurant is just something different. Has anybody been to Awamini by chance? A few hands out there. So as people who have been there know that our style of showcasing modern Indigenous foods was basically cutting out colonial ingredients. So we don't have things on our menu like dairy, wheat flour, cane sugar, beef, pork, chicken, and really focus on a lot of heirloom varietals of agriculture from Indigenous producers, a lot of wild foods around us. We just have so much more plant diversity than a typical restaurant. And we're using a lot of game meat, a lot of birds, a lot of fish, even insects. We sell quite a bit of crickets and things like that at the restaurant. And so we just really wanted to do it just to prove a point that it could be done, that we could have a modern Indigenous restaurant that's popular. It won the James Beard Award for Best New Restaurant in the U.S. when we first opened back in 2022. And again, just proving it that we can have an award-winning restaurant without ranch dressing, right? So. But I'll talk a little bit about where I came from. So I don't know who knows where Pine Ridge, South Dakota is, but it's in this kind of south central-ish South Dakota, just above Nebraska. It's wide open plains. The Badlands are mixed into the reservation too, so it's really deserty there. Lots of bluffs, lots of cactus, lots of rattlesnakes, lots of jackrabbits, lots of antelope, things like that. And so as kids, growing up on the reservation was a little bit different, because I think parenting was pretty loose. No offense to the boomers, but, the boomers were basically, I think their parenting style was just make sure you get in by dark, really. That was really the main rule for parenting, so we spent all of our time outdoors, and I think it was even more different, like growing up in the 70s and 80s and on the reservation, parenting was very loose. And I found a video that kind of explains parenting during that time period. So I want to see if this plays.
Children are.
It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?
It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?
It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?
It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?
It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are? It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?
I mean, come on, boomers. You have to have a national ad campaign to see if your kids are home or not, at 10 p.m. So again, we were full on Gen X, we were latchkey, we were a product of that situation. And, we had to make our own fun. We were definitely feral. We spent, like I said, we had to spend all of our time outdoors, but, we did our best to do things like, staying safe, keeping ourselves hydrated as much as we can, and always having access to the latest technology at the time, So, but, all fun and games. I really appreciate the childhood that I had, the freedom that we had. And, kids obviously don't get to experience that kind of situation in today's world, which is good. I mean, because again, we know where our kids are by 10 p.m. at least. And so for me, after my mom moved us off the reservation, I moved to a small town in South Dakota called Spearfish, which is in the Black Hills, where I did high school and college. And I started working in restaurants when I was 13 years old. So I was really young, and I didn't realize it was going to be a career. I didn't mean to become a chef, and I wouldn't really advise that for most people. But it's something that happened, and it's been good, but it's been a lot of work, And so for me, after working all through high school and college in the Black Hills, I remember my first restaurant job was at a restaurant called The Sluice, which was a mining-themed steakhouse, and they had a mining cart salad bar, and it was just really typical, right? And then we've all seen steakhouses and those kinds of situations. They're all over the place. But, I didn't, I just, growing up on the reservation, we didn't have a lot of native food really, and so that was something that I realized later. Because after I moved from Spearfish when I was young, probably like 23 years old, to Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I continued to work in restaurants, and I worked my way into becoming a chef at a pretty young age. I was like 27, 28 when I became a chef, and I had a pretty good career in Minneapolis and worked for lots of styles of restaurants, Spanish, French, farm to table, Japanese, all sorts of. I got a really good experience, and a few years into that career is when I had the epiphany of just realizing the complete absence of my own heritage in the food system. There were no native restaurants out there, and even today, like it's really rare to see a native restaurant if you find one, So Awamni is really the only restaurant of its kind. There's some other really amazing native restaurants out there today, but not very many. But we stuck to our philosophy of just doing something different. And so it was interesting to me that being surrounded by food history, and delving into lots of books about it, because I didn't go to school for culinary. I just worked really hard, and I basically just read a lot of books, and because we come from the generation where we read a lot of books. And so that's how I got a lot of information. And cookbooks are wonderful. There was a lot of information. But again, like there was just nothing out there. So like when we set out to make the Sous Chef's Indigenous Kitchen cookbook, which I think we have some copies here today that Beth and I can sign if we want to. But when Beth and I started working on that, when I first met her, like I was just starting. I had just started working for myself, and it was going to be a grind because I had a life savings of about $3,000, and I didn't know how to talk to banks, and there was a lot of challenges I had to get through to get to where we've come so far today. But we literally just had to like create the book because there was no resources out there, so we just kind of started with uncharted territory and just going into it, and like Beth said, it hasn't stopped. It's just going and going, so a big part of it was trying to understand Indigenous foods. A big part of it was developing a philosophy around Indigenous foods and trying to showcase to the world what's possible, because we can't go backwards. I wasn't trying to cook like it was 1491, I was really trying to showcase what we can do moving forward and how we can really start to appreciate the immense diversity of Indigenous peoples that we have in this country and beyond. And so it took a lot of thinking, because again, like there was no joy of Native American cooking, online, and we had to, and I knew the foods that I grew up with weren't native, and I remember asking my mom when I first started, did she have any like books or recipes from her grandparents or parents? And she's like, yeah, I have a cookbook from Pine Ridge, you can have it. And so I was really excited. And when I finally got the cookbook, it was this little tiny paperback, and it was not what I was looking for. And she's like, well, these are Lakota recipes. It's like, well, I'm kind of looking for recipes that don't have cream of mushroom soup in it, And so I was just going, even my mom didn't really understand what I was shooting for, at the time. So I had to really just dig in, and it took a lot of thought. It took a lot of just digging through history. And the more I learned, the more I started branching out from just understanding my Lakota heritage, but starting to understand the other Indigenous communities around us too. So I moved around a little bit. I was living in Mexico for a little while on the West Coast in the state of Nayarit. I was living in Montana for a little while. And I was just really kind of being open to understanding and seeing Indigenous peoples, and trying to figure out what would their food be like pre-colonial, before everything. And so when I started the Sous Chef in 2014, I started just doing that. But right away, I started getting a lot of press. And the first few years was always the same question from the press. It was always like, Native American foods, weird, never heard of it. What is it? So I'd have to explain that over and over again. And people didn't understand what the concepts of what are pre-colonial foods, what does that mean? What are pre-reservation foods? So then I realized that there was a lot of history involved with this, a lot of education involved. So I started doing basically this talk that's been morphing over the years, but just getting people to understand. So I kind of like to just start at the base, to understand pre-colonial foods, you have to understand what the term colonialism means, or colonization, right? So colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring another country, acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically, right? So that's something that, is still happening in today's world. We're still seeing colonization happening in many forms, Middle East, Congo, Ukraine, South America. There's different forms of colonization still very active right now of just trying to take over somebody's land space to utilize it for profit, basically, not caring about the people who happen to be in that land space. And we've seen colonization. It's not unique to North America because, again, it's a world situation, but it was largely coming out of European countries at the time. And so it really changed the world so much, And so for me, I tried to understand, how can we go backwards? So we use a lot of terms like decolonize and pieces like that. So it's important to try to understand, what does that philosophy even mean? So part of it was just understanding, what did colonization bring and what would it look like if we stopped, dealing with kind of what we've been forced into as a daily situation, because values of colonization were obviously imperialism, expansionism, capitalism, and exploitation of natural resources, dehumanization of people of color, individualism, just focusing on individual people instead of communities, cultural assimilation, scientific rationalism over lived experience, of these indigenous communities who have been so in tune with the world that they live in and just completely ignoring those lessons, and land ownership, So there's these are just some basics of some of the things that have been normalized in our lifestyle because of colonization, exactly, And when you look at the values of indigenous communities, you see a lot of community focus, right? Because everybody had to play a role in their food system, whether you're farming, gathering, processing, teaching kids how to do it, building tools, building weapons, hunting, fishing, whatever it might be. Everybody in your entire community played a role for your food security. And that's how indigenous communities were surviving for countless generations, right? But it was also land stewardship, taking care of the world around us, and community-based food systems, and reciprocity and sharing, oral tradition education, equitable consensus-based decision-making, meaning everybody had a voice. There was a lot of value in elders, there was a lot of value in lived experiences. And so people listened to a lot. I mean, there was a lot. I remember the story of when some of the people, English people, were first on the East Coast, and they were meeting up with some of the tribes. And some of those first meetings, the tribes are coming with everybody, and they meet this group of English people, and they're very confused because they're asking the English, where are your women at, And they're like, oh, this is all man's work. They don't need that. And the natives are like, well, we don't do anything without the women's voices, And that's an important story because there's so much value, again, from the different perspectives of things, And so it's just important to compare those situations because, again, the effects of colonization have been so normalized with the racism, with the land ownership, with all of these things, of putting companies and profit first over land, over community, over health, over ourselves, over our children's future. And so some of these things have to change. We have to face some big realities because there's been a lot of damage. We're all facing climate change. There's going to be massive water shortages in parts of our country right now. And we have to figure out what we can do to be smarter as humans, and how do we center ourselves on humans? Because we live in such a political divide right now where you're either red or blue and there's really no middle, but we have to learn how to ignore that and come together and really focus on humanity. We have to understand, how can we just support being humans with each other and see ourselves for who we are? We don't need all of that political divide and hate, So for me, I started rolling down this history because America is a very short history. It's not an old country because, as Lakota, we were still fighting the U.S. government until the turn of the century in the late 1800s, right? And we don't even, so there's at the beginning of when America becomes America in the late 1700s, in reality, it's just kind of these colonies kind of hugged up against the shore, right? And it changes pretty quickly throughout. So I like to focus on that century of the 1800s because that's when things changed so drastically for indigenous communities across this country. And, so we don't even start to really form these political borders until that time period anyways. And the reality is that, over 80% of this landmass is inhabited by many diverse indigenous communities families who are stewarding the land, many of them haven't even seen European people in the year 1800 yet, you know? And we don't even form what our final border until the middle of that century, until 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe. And so the United States government has always been embracing colonialism as we learn growing up, because like we don't learn about indigenous histories, we don't learn about black histories, we learn about colonization. We put the colonial history of the United States on a pedestal and talk about its glory with it completely ignoring the violence, the dehumanization, the racism, all of these things, you know, because so many people lost their lives during this one century in the 1800s. And so when you start looking backwards, like it was always built against us as indigenous peoples. You know, we were named merciless Indian savages in the Declaration of Independence, you know, so you can find that passage in there. So completely dehumanizing us from the very start. And that just continues to go on forever. And one of the most damning things to us was the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, which basically justifies the land theft, justifies taking over indigenous spaces, because the United States government learned right away that once it took over native spaces, that it could commodify it, you know. So when you're flying over the Midwest and you're looking down and you're seeing these perfect grids, that was that design. That was the Northwest Ordinance that we've still normalized today, you know. That brought land ownership, but again, like it was the United States government who was reaping the benefit of taking over all these land spaces, selling those land spaces, and just making a crap ton of money, you know. So it really becomes a global power rather quickly by just taking over this whole continent and figuring out a way to commodify it for its own profit. So we have to realize, like, again, like how devastating this was to indigenous peoples, because the only value that we had was the land that we stood upon, you know. And so during this one century, again, like at the beginning of 1800, over 80% of that landmass is occupied by indigenous peoples. By the end of that single century, less than 2% of that landmass, only because of the reservation systems. And who knows how many lives are lost during this time period. Places like California wipe out their entire indigenous population almost to completion within a 20-year period between 1850 and 1870. At the beginning of that century, there was over a few 100,000 indigenous peoples living across the state of California. When they do a census in 1873, they count less than 14,000 still alive, and you know, and that's probably a high number even. And largely because of legalized bounty systems, where you could get paid up to $200 for the body part of an indigenous person, which is why we still have bounty hunters in like American history, but we don't really understand what that truly meant, you know, because people made a ton of money. California paid out a massive amount of money for those bounties, which was paid back by the United States government, you know. And again, the state, it's literally federally sponsored genocide in the middle of the 1800s. That's what we saw. Minnesota also had a bounty system shortly after the Dakota Uprising. And so during this time period, like we see so much disruption of food systems, you know, because we see a lot of destruction of crops and seeds, because a lot of the colonial machine is ignoring this vast beauty of indigenous agriculture that was happening in such a large scale across North America. So basically, like from Mexico, corn culture shoots up all the way up the Mississippi, Missouri River valleys, basically all the way to the East Coast and into parts of Canada. And there's so much amazing agriculture. So it's hard to even know how many amazing heirloom seeds were out there at that time period, you know. And, you know, so we have no idea what was lost, but we do know how advanced a lot of these tribes were, because they basically taught a lot of the settlers coming in how to use their farming systems, how to grow crops like corns and beans and squash and sunflowers. And we see, you know, just that full-on greed of wanting the land spaces, ignoring all the beauty of all of this biodiversity, and people of color, you know, all the indigenous peoples that were living there. So George Washington, who obviously is our first president, one of his first acts as president was basically ordering the complete destruction of all the tribes in the Northeast. So he orders General Sullivan in 1779 to basically to take out all of the tribes, and he wants the total destruction and devastation of their settlements, and he wants basically everybody enslaved, you know, and that's his order to General Sullivan. So General Sullivan sets out in May of 1779 and accomplishes that within the single summer. So by September, he writes back to George Washington and says, I have done my job, everything. There's not a single side of an Indian on this side of Niagara, he writes, because everybody fled, you know, and just so much massive destruction. So still today in Haudenosaunee language, which is one of the languages in the Northeast, the literal name for U.S. president president still translates to town destroyer today because of that history, right? And that just kind of sets the precedent of how the United States government treats us as indigenous peoples moving forward. So we see things like the Homestead Act of 1862. We see things like the Morrill Act of also 1862, which creates land grant universities, which really should be called land grab universities, because many universities are still benefiting from stolen indigenous land spaces because of this situation. We see the Dawes Act of 1887. And it just kind of goes on, and it's just justifying and the continuation of the dehumanization of the indigenous peoples out there, justifying the land theft, the violence, and all of these pieces just for greed, basically, right? And so, so much violence. This is a flyer that was put up in Denver just before the Sand Creek Massacre, basically promising like anybody who signs up after they murder all the native people, they can take whatever they want to. They can keep the horses and anything that they get, and this was kind of just that sentiment of that day. Like this was normal to see that kind of racism and violence against indigenous peoples throughout the 1800s, and then, racism is still kind of deep today, but this is just to showcase like it's just there. It's just in the history books, And so we also, what was really damning to us as indigenous peoples was the loss of our own education system. So if you take time to identify I'm skipping ahead, but so the loss of the food access, the other one I wanted to talk about was the bison. Has anybody watched that Ken Burns documentary on bison, the American buffalo? Because he delves into the system, because this was a very specific act from the United States government to wipe out the bison, really for the purpose of hurting the tribes that were out there. So many of the tribes in the middle of the country were utilizing this and very strong because of this particular animal, because again, like Lakota, bison and Lakota are deeply connected. And when the bison started to disappear, it was a massive change, and it was a really intentional act, and you can find this in history too. Kill every buffalo you can, every buffalo dead is an Indian gone. Again, same sentiment out there of just not caring about the indigenous peoples, not caring about their diversity, not caring about their connection to the land and how they were surviving or taking the lessons, Places like the Pacific Northwest and throughout all of California, like we have less than 10% of the redwoods standing, even though the indigenous communities had been living with the redwoods, building houses, building boats, utilizing everything from the redwoods without ever having to cut them down, and they were almost all gone within just a few decades. And, so just to have something that was been on the planet for so long, to have it destroyed in just a couple of decades for greed, like it's insane. And if they had taken the time to learn from the indigenous communities, it could have been such a replenishable commodity to be able to utilize if we looked at it differently, if we understood how they thrived with something like that. So there's so many lessons that were just completely ignored out there because of the whole situation with colonization, right? And so, but again, like back to the education. So if you really want to focus, try to understand like what is indigenous education? Indigenous education was basically everything that was taught to us as indigenous peoples from countless generations, so much oral knowledge and history passed down because we're teaching from the time we're tiny little kids, and throughout our whole lives we're learning, and it's an understanding of like the plants and the medicines and crafting and building, and like there's so much knowledge out there, so the one thing that hurt us the most was losing that, so being forced at the turn of the century, basically my grandparents' generation, because my grandparents were born at the beginning of the century, and they should have been downloading those countless generations of amazing knowledge that had been passed down for countless generations, only to have it completely disrupted because of assimilation. So there's been a lot of stuff going on to start to uncover what really happened in the Indian boarding schools out there, and I've been to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which was the first boarding school model, because the United States government was trying to basically civilize us, but all it really did was just leave a massive generation of trauma that we're still feeling the effects from still today, because these kids in these kind of situations, these weren't fun places to go to. These kids were forced to go to these schools. These These were military-run schools. They faced harsh punishments. They faced all sorts of abuse, mental abuse, sexual abuse, death, violence. When I was at Carlisle, they said one of the punishments they gave the kids was if they got caught talking in their own language or singing in their own language, they would force them to brush their teeth with pumice stone for minutes at a time. And these are little kids, and so there's a massive graveyard at Carlisle alone, that because you shouldn't have to worry if you send your kids off to school if they're going to make it out alive, but this was the harsh reality for Indigenous peoples who were forced to send their kids to these schools to basically to wipe out the cultures, right? And it was very effective. And so these schools popped up all over the place, and especially in highly populated areas where there's still a lot of Indigenous peoples, because the United States decided it was going to be cheaper to try to assimilate and break the Indigenous peoples than to wipe them out completely. And so we see these boarding schools and residential schools basically all over the place, And the last residential school closed in 1996 up in Canada. So this isn't ancient history. And if you're Indigenous, you're touched by the Indian boarding schools in one form or another. There's a really powerful movie out there right now called Sugar Cane, and I think it's under National Geographic, but you should find it because it depicts a residential school called in their communities called Sugar Cane, and they're up in British Columbia, kind of in the south. But it kind of chronicles this boy trying to help his father understand where he came from, who his parents were, and what happened because his father was found in the 60s in an ice cream bucket about to go into an incinerator because the priest had been getting these young girls pregnant, and it was a normal situation, and they would force the young girls to have the babies, punish them for having the babies, take the babies away, put them in an incinerator. So very few babies survived. And when they started doing DNA tests, they started finding out most of their community was fathered by one or two of the priests. And this was just one instance out of hundreds, and they started searching the grounds of those. And you might have read some of that news of searching the grounds and finding all sorts of unmarked graves out there, because that's what they were doing. They were just, there's so much abuse for these kids. And these kids having to learn everything, so a different language, different religion, different history, stripping everything away that it meant to be Indigenous and meant to be diverse, and just again, we're still feeling this trauma today as Indigenous peoples out there. And we need to face the reality of what happened to our grandparents' generation, our great-grandparents' generation, and what this did to us as Indigenous communities. And that's why it's really important for us to start to fight back for our own education when it comes down to it. And so that's just the 1800s, So what was it like in the 1900s to be Indigenous? We weren't citizens until 1924, which my grandparents had been alive for a while at that point in time. At the same time, that same year, they had to create the Racial Integrity Act because they didn't have good policies to basically segregate us as Indigenous peoples. They had a lot of policies for Black Americans, but they didn't have it for Indigenous peoples quite yet because of this situation. And when Nazi Germany was forming, they looked around the world to see who else had passed legislation and governmental situations for legalized segregation and dehumanization. And of course, they found the United States government, but they deemed the U.S.'s policies against the Indigenous peoples to be too violent for them, So, and we know how that history turned out, right? We go through a couple decades of Indian termination and relocation policies in the 1940s and 1960s. One that's never talked about much is the Indian adoption era, which ran from 1941 to 1967 approximately. But the situation with this one is that during that time period, 1 out of 3 Native children are taken at birth and put into adoption services. So basically, that's a massive number. 1 out of 3 kids for 3 decades. And so again, if you're from an Indigenous community, we understand this because we've seen people in the adoption services who were taken away from their own community, and sometimes they tried to come back, but it's so hard to reconnect, because it was just another form of cultural genocide that was happening to us during these time periods, and a lot of people are, it's just a really awful time period. We couldn't vote as Indigenous peoples until 1965, like most people of color, but where I grew up in South Dakota, they wouldn't allow votes from unorganized counties, which just meant the Native counties, and today we just see massive efforts for just continuously trying to restrict votes from people of color across America today because they don't want people of color to vote, and it's always been like that. We couldn't even celebrate our own religion until 1978, which which is within my lifetime. And, for a country that's gone on about freedom of religion, it's crazy that that just never applied to the first peoples here. Like, it was illegal for us to celebrate our religions, our traditions, and at the risk of going to jail, at the risk of violence, at the risk of all sorts of things, the death, incarceration. So there's, it was so a lot of our religions and customs became very secretive because it was dangerous to be a knowledge holder of indigenous faith, of indigenous knowledge pieces like that. And so post-colonial America, like we're still kind of, colonizers. We're still like one of the major imperialists out there in the world today. Like we always searching for that never-ending frontier as Americans. And, now we have fucking Space Force, right? So like we haven't learned any lessons yet, and we have a long ways to go, because we have a huge population of Americans living here, and we are not any smarter, and just look at the weird news that's coming out with all the political opinions and stuff. Like, it's insane how much racism is so like just blatant in our faces and normalized still today, and so like we have a lot of work to do. So, but for me, like, I wanted to use food because everybody loves food, right? Everybody eats food. That's the one language that we all have in common, and I think that's one reason why chefs have become so popular, because people just love food, right? And so, but when I was growing up and I had to question, like, what was native food, because I knew this was not Lakota food, but this was on my plate often, and so I grew up with like, I've had a lot of press because people are always like, oh, you're a native chef, especially during this time of year with Native American Heritage Month and Thanksgiving coming up. People are always like, tell us what it was like to grow up eating native food on the reservation, because they want to hear the cool stories like, I'd get up in the morning, I'd hunt down a bear, I'd, take down an elk with a sling I made, and we'd have a big feast and gather a bunch of herbs and shit on the way. But that's the story they want to hear. But in reality, like, we lived in a very segregated, colonized state. So I grew up primarily with the USDA Commodity Food Program. And so this is not a great program. It feeds us. We are happy to have the food, yes, but this has nothing to do with our culture, and to like, it's a lot of fruit and bad syrups and sugars. It's a lot of vegetables packed in high sodiums. It's a lot of empty carbs, just eating powdered milk. And, because that's all we saw. We saw that at home. We saw that in the school. Like, that was our food source growing up for the longest part, and I grew up on a ranch, so like we had some access to some beef and we hunted, so we had some access to some game meat sometimes, but largely our cupboards had these commodity food program stuff, and I remember as a kid, like, we grew up way out in the country in South Dakota on the reservation. So like our bus was this big yellow Suburban, 4x4, and it would pick us up because it was just dirt roads out there in the wintertime. It's really difficult to get out to where we were living. And so we would always be the last kids to get to school. And as soon as we got to school, they would make us eat breakfast quickly. And the breakfast was always just government little tiny cereal boxes with powdered milk sitting there. You just pour it right into the box. And they would make us drink a shot of juice. And so the choices were apple, orange, or tomato. But because we were always the last kids there every day, the only choice was room temperature government tomato juice. And they would sit there and force us to drink it, gagging and throwing a fit. But we would have to drink it before we went to school, And so that's how I feel about commodity foods. But they are doing better. This administration has really helped get a lot of Native voices in a lot of presidential appointees, because we've had over I want to say 107 presidential appointees that are Native during this administration. Usually we're lucky to have 3, and so there's been some really amazing people to help us, like Deb Holland and other people, but especially in the USDA, to really kind of start to think about changing some of these systems, to not treat us as one Indian, because we have so much diversity, and there's some headway moving, but there's still an uphill battle, and the government obviously is extremely mercurial. Like, we don't know what the status is going to be in a couple of months, even right now. It could just be one way or the other, but we just have to roll with it. We have to continue to fight for the better of everything, and again, like, center towards humanity. Like, let's just be humans about it, right? And because when I was growing up, we didn't even have these colorful labels. We just had things that say beef with juices, pork with juices, chicken with juices, and it's that with juices that really sells that product, right? So So, but this is why this is just, it's a history lesson and there's a lot to talk about, but, it's really important to understand indigenous food systems, So to truly understand indigenous food systems, you have to understand diversity. So if you look at North America, just for the bioregions and ecoregions, right? It's so diverse, because we have everything in North America from tropic to Arctic. There's mountains, there's plains, there's deserts, there's swamps, there's all sorts of stuff going on in this massive continent, right? And you have to remember that indigenous peoples were living in every corner in every region, from the coldest to the hottest, and everywhere. And there was so much amazing diversity out there, and we still have quite a bit of diversity. One way to see that diversity is looking at a language map. So if you look at a native language map, you can see like this diversity that's out there. And this is very generalized because there's a lot more diversity even amongst those big color blocks. So there's other dialects, there's other languages. So this is a really generalized language map on top of that. But you can see, from the bottom of Mexico to the top of North America, there's so much diversity out there. So we envision a world where one day you can experience true cultural, regional, historical diversity and we can do that with Native American restaurants, because if we had Native restaurants, just imagine driving across the US, stopping at Native American restaurants along the way, experiencing all this amazing cultural diversity where every few hundred miles you're in a different language zone, there's different mythologies, different religions and stories, different foods and flavors and cooking techniques, so much diversity that we could be celebrating. Because today the reality is like we drive across, everything tastes the same. Everybody's got, some 3,000 calorie burger, everybody's got a poor interpretation of a Caesar salad. It's just like this, I can write the menus, I feel like, before I step into the whole restaurant all along America. And we can do so much better because we have so many cool foods if we started using heirloom varietals, if we started utilizing a lot more plant diversity and wild foods around us, because the Western diet just completely ignored like the amazing bounty of North America. And so like when we go to a grocery store, we rarely see like plant diversity. Most people are surviving off of, like if you start counting like how many plants you eat normally, right? A lot of people they'll carrot, onion, potato, strawberry, apple. A lot of people will stop counting when they're in their 20s, right? But indigenous peoples had to have a massively plant diverse diet because they had the knowledge and the privilege of understanding the world around us, So we're using all these conifers and all these tubers and all of these herbs and spices, and there's so much plant diversity around us, and we should be utilizing that more and more. And it changes geographically as we go, There's still 634 tribes in Canada, 574 in the US, and 20% of Mexico identifies as indigenous, but you can obviously see a lot more indigeneity when you're down in Mexico, So there's so much amazing indigenous diversity still alive today. And these are just federally recognized tribes. There's even more groups out there that don't have that federally recognized status, right? And there's really no comparison between colonial settler lines and indigenous territories and regions, because it's just like, it doesn't really matter who's speaking Spanish on one side of a border or French or English. Those are all European colonial languages. English is a foreign language on this land space. And we should really truly understand that. We're all speaking a European language right now today, but we should be truly understanding the amazing indigenous diversity that lies out there everywhere, even just in a small state like Wisconsin. I wouldn't say it's small, but there's a lot of amazing diversity here with indigenous peoples. There's a lot of amazing stories and tribes around us, and you can, if you go up like really high and look down, you can see the outline of the Menominee Nation just because of how they take care of their forests, and because that's really special. And there's so many stories like that out there amongst indigenous communities still today. So that's why it's really important to not only understand the indigenous wisdom that lies out there, but to start to steward it, start to try and save it, and stop trying to homogenize everything into one, stop trying to assimilate everything into one situation, Let's appreciate diversities, let's celebrate diversities. So indigenous knowledge, we're looking at all sorts of things like wild foods, permaculture, native agriculture, seed saving, seasonal lifestyles, ethno-oceanography, hunting, fishing, whole animal butchery, mycology, salt, fat, sugar productions, crafting, land stewardship, cooking techniques, metallurgy, indigenous history, star knowledge, traditional medicines, food preservation, fermentation, nutrition, health, spirituality, gender roles, and more. There's a lot of indigenous education out there, and the Western education and Western academia just kind of put itself on top for no reason whatsoever, because there's a whole bunch of other perspectives of knowledge and education around the globe, and we really need to start to appreciate that and start to save what we can and start to push it forward. Like, we don't have to just study the past, we can apply the past to make a better future. That's how we start to move forward as humans. So indigenous food knowledge, we should be very proud of the foods that came out of the Americas, because it's changed the world, And so, like, imagine, I was just in Italy. Imagine Italy without corn and polenta or tomatoes or potatoes or whatever, all of those things, chilies, chocolate, vanilla. There's so many amazing pieces that come out of the Americas. And so, like, we should be very proud of the plant diversity that has been normalized across the globe, with some of these major crops. And there's so many benefits of eating the healthier regional diets too. Because here in America, the benefits of an indigenous diet are healthier fats, diverse proteins, low carbs, low salt, so much plant diversity, organic agricultural situations and permacultural situations, celebrating and cultural and regional diversities, regional and seasonally based food systems. There's a lot of benefits to understanding and applying indigenous knowledge today. So let's talk about food for a little bit, because, food's an easy one. Proteins are an easy one, I should say, because basically anything moving you can eat. I wouldn't advise eating everything, but you can, So proteins are all around us constantly. And so when we made the conscious decision to just cut out cows, pigs and chickens, because those animals didn't exist on this continent not that long ago. So we wanted to showcase like other proteins out there. So we use bison, rabbit, elk, moose, beaver, squirrel. We have lots of birds like ducks and turkeys and quails and geese and things. Lots of lake fish, of course, because we're based in Minnesota, so there's a lot of lakes around us. But we also celebrate things on the coastal regions, and again, like having insects and crickets as normalization out there, and we shouldn't be afraid of things if it's not a cow, a pig, or a chicken, because there's a lot of amazing protein, and and it wouldn't hurt us to like push back against those industries because they're very destructive, so there's a lot of work we should be doing. And one lesson we do learn about indigenous peoples growing up in schools is how, in a very generalized lesson plan, Native Americans in general used all parts of the bison, right? But that lesson is really about our resourcefulness, because we didn't have the privilege to be wasteful. And like today, we just literally buy something and throw it away moments later. We just create so much trash, right? And so, like, as indigenous peoples, we had countless generations of knowledge, and what we did have was the privilege of knowing what to do with everything, all the byproducts, all the pieces, and just learning how to be not wasteful at all. So we can all work towards that somehow or another. But again, like, we have to be open to different kinds of proteins, because there's just a lot of amazing stuff out there. I was just down in Oaxaca, where it's so normal to see just massive amounts of insects out there in the markets, and there's just insects. There's I counted 8 different varieties of insect pieces that were on various food forms down there in Oaxaca. And it's so normal, like everybody eats them and they can taste good, So I think at Awamni, we go through about 15 pounds of crickets, and we put crickets on the state fair, in Minnesota State Fair, which is a big state fair, on the menu this year. And I think we went through 40 pounds of crickets or something. And that's a lot of crickets, because crickets don't weigh that much, so 40 pounds is a massive amount of crickets to be selling Americans to eat. So, but people are willing to try, and it's just a better situation. Like, it's easier on our whole situation if we had different kinds of proteins in our diets too. But for me, what's really helped me with my journey, with my work, was really just the plant knowledge, because it was something that I could connect with my indigenous ancestry immediately. It's something, learning plant knowledge, knowing that my ancestors had an immense education system about identifying plants, because plants are everything. Plants can be food, plants can be medicine, you can craft with them, you can paint with them, you can make tools and weapons out of them, lodging, clothing. Like, plants are everything, and plants are woven into our religions, and we have such deep connections to the plant world around us because they support us. us, they help us move forward. So when we open up our eyes and stop just looking at, like, this is a picture of just walking around North Dakota and just looking and just like seeing so much amazing, beautiful plant diversity, So like stop calling everything a weed, because that just means you don't know what it is, right? Everything has a name. Take the time to learn the name of the plants, what it's good for you. And today we have our smartphones. We can just take a picture of a plant with an app and it'll, with high accuracy, tell you what it is, So take the time to start to research, So when we opened up the restaurant Owamni in Minneapolis, it's owned by the Minneapolis Park Board, so we talked them into putting only indigenous plants across the park, and then after that we put little placards all over the place. So the placards would show the Dakota name of the plant, because that's the true name of that plant in that soil. That's its name where it's living right now. Then it would have an English name and a descriptor, so you can have this kind of passive education. But imagine schools doing that, just like around the school, around the campus or whatever, just putting placards identifying what these are, putting the true native names if you want to go that far, but just giving everybody the education, because this was a massive part of our education as Indigenous communities everywhere. We all learned plants. It was a huge part of how we survived. When Lewis and Clark were making their way to the West Coast, they had to ban all of their people from gathering carrot-like plants because they kept getting themselves sick because they didn't know, but they would allow the young Native woman with them to gather them. So this 12, 13-year-old woman was able to, because of her education system, help them find lots of these plant sources, because she can identify the difference between some of these plants, because some of those carrot-like plants can really hurt you if you don't know what you're doing, right? So it's just important to understand like how valuable that knowledge of plants are, so we should be teaching that. I always tease that our kids can name more Kardashians than they can tree species. We have to do way better at our education, so there's, and just understanding how people have been surviving, like what's our building blocks. As humans, we need certain things to survive, so we have to get our energy from somewhere, typically from carbohydrates or fat, and depending on where we are. But people like, this is a picture of a prairie turnip that we call Timpsila, that still grows out on the Great Plains, but it's really largely just been going away for so long because, number one, it followed the bison around. The bison helped spread it around. And then so the disappearance of the bison, the introduction of cattle, which ate the wrong plants, because they weren't from these land regions, the introduction of barbed wire fences, which inhibit movement of people and animals. So we just, it was such a major bio change that happened across North America in a very short time period because of those kinds of situations. But Indigenous peoples, we're finding these building blocks to stay alive, and there's so much to learn out there. And there's also things like the camas root in the Pacific Northwest and those regions, which is really important, but also very sparse out there nowadays because of these kinds of situations. The true wild rice that's in these Great Lake regions, and harvesting here in Wisconsin, Minnesota, but we're seeing, because of climate change and warmer waters, that this is going to be a crop that's kind of slowly shifting northward to try to keep up with the colder waters and things like that. And plus, we've just ruined a lot of natural wild rice places so people can put their lake homes and mow down these areas so they can, boat around and jet ski and stuff like that. Like, we just have to be way smarter about how we take care of our land spaces, And that knowledge of plants is massive too, because, water plants are big. And people that lived on the coast, they have a whole other food system off the land, and people have this vast knowledge that they've been utilizing for countless generations. And, or if you're in deserty areas where all the plants look like they want to hurt you or maim you, right? And I always thought it was kind of silly to use the term food desert because, people that lived in the desert, Indigenous communities, all they saw was food around them because they knew how to look at the world differently. They knew how to look and see all of their plant relatives that are around that were going to keep them alive for generations to come, So when I think of a food desert, I think of a suburb when there's just no good restaurants, and everything's just over processed foods, and it's we need to do better, So really, we have to learn. We have to pass down the knowledge of plants to the next generations. We have to figure out to make that really important, And let's talk about agriculture, because agriculture is a massive thing, and the Indigenous agriculture has been largely completely overlooked, just like a lot of Indigenous knowledge, but we live in a world today, of course, where we feel like we're, very advanced with our agricultural systems, but we also know like what it takes to maintain these systems, and the dangers of these situations, And so like when you see things like how worried should we be that glyphosate was found in your Cheerios, like you should be really worried because like we're going to find out very soon what happened to us as we've been microdosing glyphosate for the past two decades and more, Like there's going to be a lot of situations. We're basically just guinea pigs, of what's going to happen to us because you can't get away from it. It's in the middle of your grocery store and everything, right? So that's why it's really important to support growers who know what they're doing, who aren't using these really dangerous chemicals that are getting into our water, getting into our soil, getting into our homes, getting into our bodies, right? We have to be way smarter because indigenous peoples, they had such vast agriculture, So this is a map of everywhere that corn culture spread. And so like this is, from the bottom of Mexico, throughout almost all of Mexico, throughout the Caribbean, throughout, again, a huge chunk all the way up the Mississippi, Missouri River valleys, all the way to the East Coast, like so much amazing corn culture. And just think of all the beautiful diversity of seeds that were out there before the destruction in the 1800s, as colonization was really ramping up. And you can trace that. So if you ever go down to Mexico, you can start studying some of the indigenous communities and how they're surviving. Like it's amazing with how they figured things out, how to turn teosinte into corn, and how to like nixtamalize corn to make it healthier. So when you nixtamalize corn, you're washing it in an alkaline bath, and that followed everywhere corn went, like all the way up in these regions and past us. People were utilizing the nixtamalization process because when you nixtamalize the corn, it makes that corn soluble for your body, right? So you wash it in an alkaline bath, which traditionally was a lot of wood ash, because whenever you put anything, whenever you cook anything down to ash form, all you have left are minerals. So it alkalizes the water, right? And when you make that alkalized water and cook the corn, it kind of dissipates the outer kernel, makes it soft, and then it kind of swells the kernel out itself. But again, because it makes it soluble for your body, you're getting all these really important building blocks because you're getting calcium, potassium, magnesium, iron, zinc, niacin, all these things that are really important for us as humans to have. And people who were living in these corn regions were living really healthy diets because of how they were processing their food. So when corn became popularized in Europe and places like Italy, they discovered quickly that they were making themselves sick because they didn't take the time to learn the nixtamalization process, and they were just living off of cornmeal diets, and they were giving themselves pellagra, which caused all sorts of really nasty health issues for them, But if they had taken the time to learn how the generations of and diverse cultures were processing the corn and nixtamalizing it, because even just the simple process of washing it a little bit in that bath will help open up and unlock that corn for its full potential to get all that nutrition that we need. And so it's amazing to study the indigenous cultural and diverse farming systems, from Mexico traveling all the way northwards, because like where Mexico City is, they were feeding over nearly 300,000 people and more with organic farming systems. They didn't have to spray chemicals on stuff, they had figured it out, and they kept their water extremely clean on top of that, So again, so much advanced agriculture going on, and you can trace it northward. You can trace some of these seed varietals of dent varietals and flowered varietals of corns. This is a Zuni farm in New Mexico where they figured out how to irrigate and farm in the middle of the desert for a few thousand years, which is a massive feat, to be able to figure that out and to figure out varietals that are going to be more drought resistant, heat resistant, and things like that, and be able to thrive in a very deserty area, right? Some of you have heard of the Three Sisters situation with the corns and beans and squash, where you plant the corn, the beans crawl up the corn stalk, the squash kind of helps cover, and it's a very, it's a very like symbiotic growing system. This was one particular growing system, and you see this largely in the East Coast, right? Because the Three Sisters literally have a lot of religious meetings to a lot of the tribes out that way. But again, because we are so diverse as indigenous peoples, we figured out all sorts of ways to farm, which we could be learning from still today. Right? This is a picture of Buffalo Bird Woman, who's a Hidatsa woman living in North Dakota, and you can see the Missouri River Valley behind her. And there's a book out there called Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden, which is an amazing book because it depicts her memories growing up a Hidatsa woman in an agricultural community where they're growing corns and beans and squash and sunflowers and tobacco and things like that. And she talks about all this cool diversity and how they laid everything out. And it's such an amazing look at indigenous agriculture because it's so rare, but it's it's also even more rare because it's coming from a female voice, and female voices never make it through history hardly at all, especially as a woman of color, you know? So it's a really special book. You guys should really find that if you haven't read it already, because it's important to know, like, all these amazing diverse heirloom seeds come from very specific communities and hold so much story. And we should really be allowing to, instead of just trying to grow these seeds for profit, to allow the indigenous communities to continue these legacies, you know, to continue to support, because these seeds will die. Like when I went to the Field Museum, when I first started this work back in 2016, I discovered they had 100,000 cobs of corn in their archives in the basement, just in shoe boxes that they had gathered from various like tribal communities, right? But because they're sitting there for 80 plus years, like they're literally just archives now, you know? And so if they had, these are living beings, like we need to put them in the ground to continue their legacy. And again, like we should be doing everything to help support and steward these indigenous communities holding on to these seeds, because they're the ones that have the stories that go back to where they come from and how they've been a part of our lives for so long. And there's just such still amazing seed diversity. But again, like we have no idea what was lost during that really violent time in the 1800s when so much of this seed was just lost to history completely, you know, and we'll just never know, basically. So how do we apply this knowledge in today's world? You know, how does this make sense for us to utilize some of this work? How do we pay homage to our indigenous ancestries? You know, and we have to understand that indigenous foods are truly medicine for us. Like they really help us, and we can have a healthier diet, you know. I wish that we could be giving the conference recipes to have some healthy indigenous food so you could truly taste it, but you're just going to have to come to the restaurant in Minneapolis, I guess, right now. And again, like I already did the benefits of the indigenous diets, but when I first started the sous chef, like we just started applying that, you know. Beth was with us on many occasions where we're just running around grabbing stuff and just trying to figure out what to do with it and having fun, you know, and teaching these young chefs and these young kids to make this a part of their lifestyles, which they still hold on to today, you know, and just seeing the world differently, you know, and just opening up your eyes and starting to see food basically everywhere, and like taking the time to make our own spices. Like we don't need our grandmother's spice rack that was passed down from the 60s in those weird little tins. Like we could take the time to make food taste like where we live, you know. And it's fun to play with these indigenous ingredients and these flavors and things that you're not going to find in your grocery store, you know, because like I have chef friends that will call me up and like, hey, where can I get some cedar? And I'll be like, outside, you know. They're like, well, where can I buy it from? It's like, I don't know, but you can go outside. You know? So like we just are stuck in this mindset that food has to have a monetary situation, you know, and it doesn't necessarily at all, you know. And as chefs, we can put a lot of expression on a plate, a lot of intention on a plate, you know. So when we cut out all those things, we created a really healthy diet, because at the restaurant, everything, because we cut out dairy, wheat flour, cane sugar, beef, pork, chicken, everything is gluten-free, dairy-free, sugar-free, soy-free, pork-free, you know, it's just not free. But it's fun, you know, to make food taste like a place. You know, this is rabbit, wild rice, white cedar, maple, cranberries. Like here in Wisconsin, you can just stand in a spot, look around and see all that stuff growing around you, you know, if you're in the right spot. But like start making food taste like where you live, you know, and it's fun to play with the flavors around us and keeping things simple. Like it doesn't have to be overcomplicated. Sometimes food is just beautiful the way it is, you know, and just some simple cooking techniques like cooking with fire or whatever, smoking some squash, putting a little maple syrup and toasting some seeds. Like it could be that simple, right? So evolving, you know, for us, like we just want to help evolve these food systems, and because evolving indigenous health and culture with food is a really big priority of what we're trying to do, because we need to help get this food first off back into our indigenous communities where we've been separated from it for too long, because it's rare to even find indigenous foods in an indigenous community still today, you know. And so we're working on really trying to change that, and we truly believe that indigenous food sovereignty is possible, because we just need healthy food access, cultural food producers, regional food systems, local control, meaning non-governmental control, because so much of USDA rules inhibit us from even having our own native foods, you know. Because like up in Alaska, like they can't buy caribou to sell to their communities, but if one gets hit by a truck on the road, they will give it to the tribe. So what makes it safer to have like a smeared caribou off the highway compared to somebody raising them and selling them, you know? And it's just weird USDA rules that inhibit us, you know? So we need to change that stuff. And we just need, you know, we need obviously access to this indigenous education and really grow that. And we need environmental protections too, because it's really important, you know? And it's crazy that, again, I think it was Winona LaDuke when she was young, and she's like, why does just wanting to protect our water make me a terrorist? When an oil company who's like literally destroying everything, like they get all these rights, you know, like it's insane that that things are reframed like that we're bad for wanting to protect things, you know? So my work and my vision, most of the work I'm doing through the nonprofit I created, which is called NATIFS, and it's an acronym, North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. So when you start a nonprofit, you have to come up with a catchy acronym. So NATIFS is easier to say, but our main two goals with NATIFS is really just creating access to Indigenous education and stewarding it, and creating access to Indigenous foods, and really highlighting the importance of that, you know. And so we're doing that, what we've created in Minneapolis with a space called the Indigenous Food Lab, where we've opened up a public-facing space that is a market, which is a place for distribution. We have a USDA-certified kitchen, so we can create more products for the market spaces and start to work on distribution of moving that food around, both retail and wholesale, and even working on food relief situations as needed. We have an Indigenous education studio where we're doing a lot of video work. So if you go to our website, you can find some of our videos. And we're working on Indigenous food service support, meaning I want to compete with the Aramarks of the world, because so many of our schools are just buying this crap food from Aramarks and Sysco's and US Foods, heating them up, and it's not good for us. So I want to move into a space where we're just starting to purchase these foods like corn and rice from Indigenous communities, making big dishes of things that are just ready to eat for people, so people can start to order these foods through us, you know? That's one way of just getting the food out there. Again, because like universities, conferences, hospitals, like there's no reason to not have healthy food in any of these areas, you know? And I know, again, like the price points can be so low, but we can figure it out. We can work to making healthy food at these low levels, right? And so like the market space is just a beautiful little space where people can order online. So you can order online products today if you go to our website and find we have over 50 different Indigenous producers on in our situation right now. We're working really hard on different forms of education for people to utilize. I just finished my second cookbook, which is going to be basically Turtle Island, so looking at all of North America from Mexico through Alaska and seeing it through all the Indigenous lens, you know. And it'll be out about this time next year, but it was a massive volume of work to put together, and I'm excited that that'll be out there. I think this is a quick little video to kind of share what we're doing at the Food Lab with the video spaces.
I'm Winona Maya, and we're here at the Indigenous Food Lab Kitchen. Today, we're going to be making sun cookies. Sun cookies is a recipe that comes together with only 3 ingredients. I have here about 4 cups of sunflower seeds, 2 cups of maple syrup, and a pinch of salt. So let's start. First, we're gonna preheat the oven.
So that's just a little snippet, but our goal is just to create as many videos as possible, because today's generation, everybody's learning everything in little tiny snippets, you know, everything's TikTok style, but this young generation, they're absorbing so much, you know, and we just want to put that out there just to like create a ton of videos so it could live out there, you know. And so we invested in a lot of spaces, and we just want to start doing that, and, you know, and just having fun with foods, because try creating a dessert without dairy, flour, or sugar, but we've come up with all sorts of fun ways to do that, you know. And we really want to just push for more community gardens and permacultural spaces and really utilizing the land better, you know, because, you know, lawns are fucking stupid. Like, we need to really work harder as humans, right? Because we're not smart yet. You know, we're going through massive water crisis. I just read an article, an opinion piece in New York Times where they're basically saying, like, we might have to, because of the water crisis coming in California, we might have to start building pipelines from Minnesota to California. I was like, that's so stupid. Like, why? Like, maybe like get rid of golf courses, you know, stop almond production, you know, I don't know, like stop overwatering wine production, because as much as we want to try and live off of wine, it's just not not possible because I've tried multiple times, you know? And so like we need to really put our water resources into surviving as humans, which is food production, you know? And we really need to be smarter about it because like Palm Springs, California, that has 120 golf courses, right? So if we have the ability to turn the desert into this green oasis, we should be doing that for the purpose of making food, you know, not just for keeping golfers' shoes clean, right? We need to be way, way smarter as humans, and we're not even close to being there quite yet, you know? And like, we just want to see more indigenous food businesses out there. So like when I first started, Beth was around when we opened up the Tatanka truck, you know, and we opened up this cool native food truck. And I didn't know how it was going to go over because I didn't know what was going to happen when the natives found out that I didn't have any fry bread on the truck, you know, but like we worked it out, you know, and it's become very popular because again, we just started practicing this philosophy and showcasing it was possible and showcasing that we could do it. You know, so when Awamni opened up, same situation. And Awamni is actually a part of the nonprofit because Awamni plays like restaurants don't help with food relief or food access, but restaurants do play an important role. And using it as a nonprofit piece really helps me because for me, it's job creation because we have over 100 employees at Awamni. 70% of that staff is indigenous. We're creating a ton of jobs. It's a built-in engine to move food product because we prioritize purchasing from indigenous producers first. And we're moving nearly $1 million a year directly into indigenous food production because of the success of this restaurant, right? And the restaurant's just a place to voice what we do, you know? And oops, I already did this one, but our goal is to not only, so you get here. Our goal is to not only create what we've created here in Minnesota with the Food Lab Market, the production kitchen to move into larger food productions and create distribution points, the education programming and creating all the videos, a restaurant to basically be a nonprofit engine to help things move along. But we're actively opening up in Bozeman, Montana right now, and we're going to continue to build out in other areas because we're looking at places on the East Coast, South Dakota, Alaska, and we're going to kind of build in urban centers and basically create a hub and spoke system of support to see more indigenous food and stewarding more indigenous education in other regions, you know, and basically just creating what we've created in Minnesota. And eventually we can just kind of move all over the place, you know, and open up in areas everywhere to support more indigenous producers and growers, to support more food production, to see healthier food out there in school systems, and eventually crossing colonial borders because we can, you know, we can be down in Mexico or up in Canada and even beyond, you know, down the road. But I know a lot of this might not even happen in my lifetime, but it doesn't matter. Like we just have to start building it now. We have to leave this place better than what we stepped into, you know, and that's a big part of our work. It's not about being a celebrity chef. It's just about what can we do to really change the future, to really center us towards humanity, you know, when it comes down to how are we going to thrive as humans moving forward. And we need to change a lot of things, you know. We've normalized the colonization and colonialism, imperialism for far too long, you know, and we're allowing those people to run our world. And we need to change that because we have the majority of people and voices here. We have to bind together and really rise up to protect ourselves as humans, you know, and get away from just what we're seeing today. Because if you control your food, you can control your destiny, just like our indigenous people's done. They've taken that power of food away from us, you know. We're taught that we have to buy food to have food, and that's not necessarily the case. We have plenty of growers in here, and if we just supported each other, we would have plenty of food to survive off of, you know. And I think the global pandemic should have taught us big lessons about supporting our local producers as much as possible, you know. And so eventually, like, I want to move around the world. I want to be able to help strengthen other indigenous communities just using the same programmings that we're doing today, you know. And so what can you do is to basically support indigenous initiatives globally, call out cultural appropriation when you see it, identify colonialism in action and just name it for what it is, right? Support your fellow humans, you know, because there's a lot of people with that massive needs going on out there today. Create a relationship with the plant world, help dismantle white supremacy, which, by the way, does not like being dismantled, but we got to do it. Create less trash for everybody, you know, we just have to work on that. Grow more food, and the future will be indigenous if we work together, you know, but it's going to take all of us to center on that humanity. We have to work together. We have to be smarter about food, about environment, about education, about history, all these things. You know, I'm probably illegal in Florida right now. Like, we need to change that. So that's my talk. Thank you, guys.